Trayvon Benjamin Martin was a 17-year-old African-American high school student. He was known for his bright smile and kind heart, a young man full of potential and promise. He lived in Miami Gardens, Florida, a vibrant community where he spent most of his childhood. Miami Gardens was more than just a place. It was home, filled with memories and experiences that shaped who he was. Like any regular teenager, he enjoyed video games, sports, and spending time with friends. Trayvon loved playing basketball, often seen shooting hoops with his buddies, and he was an avid fan of video games, spending countless hours immersed in virtual worlds. He had dreams for the future. Trayvon aspired to make a difference in the world, dreaming of a career that would allow him to give back to his community and support his family. Tragically, his life was cut short on February 26, 2012. That day marked a devastating loss, not just for his family, but for the entire nation. He was visiting his father and his father's fiancée in Sanford, Florida. This visit, meant to be a time of bonding and joy, turned into a nightmare that would forever alter the course of many lives. This visit turned fatal, sparking national outrage and igniting a conversation about race and justice in America. The circumstances of his death led to widespread protests and a demand for accountability. Trayvon's story is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger narrative of racial injustice that has plagued the United States for centuries, a painful reminder of the ongoing struggle for equality. It reflects a painful history of racial injustice in the United States. The systemic discrimination faced by African Americans has deep roots, and Trayvon's death brought these issues to the forefront of national consciousness. His death forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. It made people question the fairness of the justice system and the pervasive nature of racial biases in everyday life. It highlighted the deep-seated biases and systemic inequalities that continue to plague American society. These issues are not new, but Trayvon's story brought them into sharp focus, demanding attention and action. Trayvon's story is a stark reminder of the human cost of prejudice and discrimination. His life, full of potential, was tragically cut short, and his death serves as a powerful symbol of the need for change. His death sparked protests and demonstrations across the country. People from all walks of life came together to demand justice, not just for Trayvon, but for all victims of racial injustice. People demanded justice for Trayvon and called for an end to racial profiling and police brutality. The outcry was a call to action, a plea for a more just and equitable society. The Black Lives Matter movement, formed in response to Trayvon's death, has become a powerful force for change. This movement has grown, advocating for the rights and dignity of African Americans and challenging systemic racism. This movement continues to challenge systemic racism and advocate for equality. It is a testament to Trayvon's legacy, a reminder that his life, though tragically short, has inspired a movement that seeks to create a better, more just world for all. On that fateful night, Trayvon went to a nearby convenience store. He bought a bag of Skittles and an iced tea. He was walking back to his father's fiancée's house when he was spotted by George Zimmerman. Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch volunteer. He was patrolling the gated community. Zimmerman considered Trayvon suspicious. He called the police to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. He described Trayvon as a black male who looks like he's up to no good. Despite being advised by the dispatcher not to follow Trayvon, Zimmerman disregarded the instruction and pursued the teenager. An altercation ensued. Shots were fired. Trayvon Martin, unarmed and carrying only a bag of candy and a drink, was fatally shot by George Zimmerman. Zimmerman claimed self-defense. He said Trayvon attacked him. The police initially accepted Zimmerman's account. He was not arrested or charged. The lack of an arrest in Trayvon's death sparked outrage, igniting a firestorm of emotions and calls for justice across the nation. People across the country were shocked and angered, unable to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur without immediate legal consequences. Protests erupted in Sanford and spread nationwide, with communities coming together to demand accountability and justice for Trayvon. Social media became a powerful platform for sharing information, mobilizing support, and uniting voices in solidarity with Trayvon and his family. The case quickly gained national attention, drawing the eyes of the nation and the world to the small town of Sanford, Florida. It became a flashpoint for discussions about race, gun violence, and the criminal justice system in America, sparking debates that reached every corner of society. Many people believed that Trayvon had been racially profiled by Zimmerman, a belief that resonated deeply with those who had experienced similar prejudices. They argued that he was perceived as a threat simply because he was a young black man wearing a hoodie, a symbol that became emblematic of racial profiling. The case exposed the deep racial divisions that still exist in American society. bringing to light the systemic issues that many had long felt, but were rarely discussed so openly. It highlighted the stark disparities in how Black and white Americans are treated by law enforcement and the justice system. Disparities that have long been a source of pain and frustration for communities of color. The outcry over Trayvon's death demonstrated the urgent need for a national conversation about race and equality, a conversation that continues to evolve and challenge the status quo. Candlelight vigils and community gatherings were held in Trayvon's honor, serving as poignant reminders of the collective grief and the ongoing fight for justice. There were also calls for legislative changes and reforms, with activists and lawmakers pushing for policies that would prevent such tragedies in the future. Trayvon Martin's legacy continues to inspire the fight for justice, equality, and the hope for a future where no one is judged by the color of their skin. The case also brought to light the controversial Stand Your Ground law in Florida. This law allows individuals to use deadly force if they feel threatened. Critics argued that this law contributed to Trayvon's death. They claimed it emboldened Zimmerman to pursue and confront Trayvon. The Stand Your Ground law became a focal point of the debate. Supporters of the law argued that it protected individuals' right to self-defense. Opponents argued that it encouraged vigilantism and disproportionately impacted communities of color. The debate over Stand Your Ground laws continues to this day. It highlights the complexities of gun control and self-defense laws in the United States. After weeks of intense public pressure and widespread media coverage, George Zimmerman was eventually arrested and charged with second-degree murder. His trial began in June 2013, capturing the attention of the entire nation. It became one of the most closely watched and highly debated trials in recent history, drawing in viewers from all walks of life. The prosecution argued vehemently that Zimmerman had racially profiled Trayvon Martin and unjustly killed him in cold blood. They presented evidence and testimonies to support their claim that Trayvon was an innocent victim. On the other hand, the defense maintained that Zimmerman acted in self-defense, arguing that Trayvon had attacked Zimmerman first, leaving him with no choice but to defend himself. This clash of narratives created a highly charged atmosphere in the courtroom. After weeks of emotional testimonies and legal arguments, the jury ultimately acquitted Zimmerman of all charges. This controversial verdict sparked further protests across the country and reignited the national debate about race, justice, and the legal system's treatment of people of color. The trial and its outcome became a focal point for discussions on systemic racism and the need for reform. The acquittal of George Zimmerman left many people feeling deeply angry, frustrated, and heartbroken. It reinforced the belief among many that the justice system often fails to protect communities of color, and that racial biases continue to influence legal outcomes. The emotional response from the public was palpable, with many expressing their sorrow and outrage through protests and social media. The verdict highlighted the deep racial disparities that persist in the American legal system. It served as a stark reminder of the work that still needs to be done to achieve true equality and justice for all. The case of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin became a catalyst for ongoing conversations and movements aimed at addressing and rectifying these systemic issues. It underscored the urgent need for racial justice reform and the importance of continuing the fight for a fair and equitable society. The tragic death of Trayvon Martin resonated deeply with the history of the civil rights movement. It evoked memories of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955. Till's murder, like Trayvon's, sparked national outrage and galvanized the civil rights movement. Both cases exposed the brutal realities of racism and the vulnerability of black children in America. They highlighted the urgent need for social and legal change. The parallels between these cases, separated by decades, underscore the ongoing struggle for racial justice in the United States. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s brought about significant legal and social progress. It led to the passage of landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, the fight for equality is far from over. The death of Trayvon Martin served as a catalyst for the Black Lives Matter movement. Founded in 2013, this movement has become a powerful force for social change, bringing renewed attention to the issues of police brutality, racial profiling, and mass incarceration. Black Lives Matter has challenged systemic racism and demanded justice for victims of racial violence. It has organized protests, engaged in political activism, and raised awareness about the experiences of black people in America. The movement has amplified the voices of marginalized communities and inspired a new generation of activists. Despite facing criticism and opposition, with some accusing it of being divisive or anti-police. Black Lives Matter has remained steadfast in its mission to fight for racial justice and equality. It has forced a national reckoning with the legacy of racism and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. The tragic story of Trayvon Martin highlights the pervasive nature of systemic racism, which is embedded in the very fabric of American society. It manifests in disparities in education, healthcare, housing, and the criminal justice system. Rooted in the history of slavery and segregation in the United States, systemic racism is perpetuated through implicit bias, discriminatory policies, and institutional practices. Addressing systemic racism requires a fundamental shift in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. It requires acknowledging the ways in which racism is woven into the fabric of society. It demands dismantling the structures and systems that perpetuate inequality and calls for a commitment to creating a more just and equitable society for all. The fight for racial justice and equality continues in the 21st century. It requires ongoing advocacy, activism, and reform. It demands holding elected officials accountable, challenging discriminatory policies, and promoting social justice. There are many ways to get involved in the fight for racial justice. You can support organizations working to dismantle systemic racism. You can educate yourself and others about the history of racism and its ongoing impact. You can use your voice to advocate for change. You can vote for candidates who prioritize racial justice. You can hold elected officials accountable for their actions. You can challenge racism and discrimination in your own communities. Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world. Trayvon Martin's death was a tragedy. It was a stark reminder of the human cost of racism and prejudice. It ignited a national conversation about race, justice, and equality. His legacy continues to inspire activism and advocacy. We must remember Trayvon Martin. We must honor his memory by continuing to fight for justice and equality. We must work to create a world where no